The needle slipped through her trembling fingers for the third time that morning, and Margaret Morrison watched it fall to the dusty floorboards of the cramped bedroom she shared with her husband in his mother's house, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Through the thin walls of the Cherry Creek, Nevada boarding house that Constance Whitmore had turned into a prison of judgment and cruel words, she could hear her mother-in-law's voice rising in complaint to whoever would listen, likely Mrs. Henderson from down the street, who came by every Tuesday morning like clockwork. 5 years married and not a single grandchild to show for it. Constance's voice carried like a whip crack through the September heat of 1883. My poor Thomas tied himself to a barren woman, completely useless as a wife. What good is a woman who cannot fulfill her most basic purpose? Margaret's hand stilled over the shirt she had been mending, one of Thomas's work shirts that he had torn on a fence post last week. The fabric felt rough against her palms, worn thin from too many washings, much like her own spirit had grown threadbare under the constant barrage of her mother-in-law's disappointment. She was 23 years old, had been married since she was 18, and every month that passed without the hoped-for pregnancy brought fresh ammunition for Constance's attacks. The door to the bedroom opened without a knock, and Constance stood there, her iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face into a permanent expression of displeasure. Her dark eyes swept over Margaret with the same dismissive look she might give to a piece of damaged goods at the general store. "Still sitting idle, I see," Constance said, though Margaret held the mending clearly in her hands. "While there is washing to be done and supper to prepare. Though I suppose it does not matter how well you cook or clean when you cannot give my son what he truly needs. A real woman would have filled this house with children by now." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a fragile thing that had been bending under pressure for far too long. She set the mending aside carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled, and stood to face her mother-in-law. "I have done everything you have asked of me since the day I married Thomas. I work from dawn until long after dark. I have tried to be a good wife and a good daughter to you." "A good wife gives her husband children," Constance snapped. "That is the bargain of marriage. Thomas could have had his pick of girls in this town, girls from good families with proven bloodlines, but he chose you because he thought you were pretty. Well, pretty fades, and you are left with nothing but a useless, barren woman taking up space in my house." The word barren landed like a physical blow, one Margaret had absorbed so many times she should have been numb to it by now. But somehow it still had the power to cut straight through to her heart. She opened her mouth to respond, but Constance had already turned away, her skirts swishing as she disappeared back down the narrow hallway. Margaret sank back onto the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. She could hear the sounds of Cherry Creek through the single window, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, horses passing on the main street, the everyday sounds of a town going about its business while her own life seemed to be crumbling into dust. Thomas would be home soon from his job at the Silver Star mine just outside of town. He worked long hours in the darkness below ground, coming home each evening covered in rock dust and exhaustion, and Margaret knew he would once again find himself caught between his mother and his wife. He loved his mother, that much was clear, but Margaret had begun to wonder if he truly loved her, or if Constance had been right, and he had simply been dazzled by a passing attraction that had long since faded. She picked up the mending again, forcing her fingers to work even though her vision remained blurred. The shirt needed to be finished before Thomas came home, and then there was supper to prepare, though Constance would no doubt criticize every dish that made it to the table. Margaret had grown up on a small ranch outside of town, the only daughter of Samuel and Martha Morrison, and her mother had taught her to cook and sew and manage a household. When her parents had died within months of each other 3 years ago, victims of a pneumonia outbreak that had swept through the county, Margaret had been left alone except for Thomas and his mother. The thought of her parents brought fresh grief, still sharp even after all this time. They had loved her unconditionally, had never made her feel that her worth was tied to anything other than her character and her heart. Her mother had suffered through her own struggles with bearing children, having lost 3 babies before Margaret was born, and then being unable to conceive again after. She had never spoken of it as a failing, only as a sorrow, and her father had loved her mother with a devotion that had been beautiful to witness. Margaret wondered what her parents would tell her to do now. Would they counsel her to stay, to endure, to believe that things would improve? Or would they want more for their daughter than this half-life of constant criticism and diminishing hope? The afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting golden squares across the floor, and Margaret worked mechanically until she heard the front door open and Thomas's heavy footsteps in the main room. She heard his mother's voice immediately launch into conversation, too low for Margaret to make out the words but the tone unmistakable. Constance would be telling him about Margaret's supposed laziness, about her failure as a wife, poisoning the well before Margaret even had a chance to see her husband. When Thomas finally appeared in the doorway of their bedroom, Margaret looked up from her mending and felt her heart sink further. His face was drawn with more than just physical exhaustion, and he would not quite meet her eyes. He was a decent-looking man, Thomas Whitmore, with dark hair and blue eyes that had once looked at her with something that resembled affection. But somewhere along the way, between his mother's constant complaints and the absence of the children they had both wanted, that warmth had cooled into something that looked more like resignation. "Mother says you were disrespectful to her today," Thomas said quietly, setting his lunch pail on the small table by the door. Margaret set down the now finished shirt, folding it carefully. "Your mother called me barren and useless. I simply told her that I have done everything asked of me." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his dust-covered hair. "She is worried about our future, Margaret, about the family line. Is that so wrong? Is it wrong for her to speak to me as though I am less than human?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I have tried, Thomas. For 5 years I have tried to be what she wants, what you want. But I cannot control whether or not we have children. That is in God's hands, not mine." "Maybe you should see the doctor again," Thomas suggested, and there was something in his tone that made Margaret's chest tighten. "There are treatments, things that might help." "I have seen 3 doctors," Margaret said. "They all say there is nothing wrong with me. That these things take time, that some couples wait years. But your mother does not want to hear that. She wants someone to blame, and I am the convenient target." Thomas looked away toward the window, and Margaret saw the truth written clearly on his face. He believed his mother. Somewhere in the past 5 years, he had come to accept Constance's verdict that Margaret was at fault, that she was the broken piece in their marriage. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. "I see," Margaret said softly. "You think she is right." "I did not say that," Thomas protested, but the denial came too late and without conviction. Margaret stood, smoothing down her skirts with hands that had finally stopped trembling because she had reached some kind of emotional bedrock beyond which she could not fall. "You did not have to say it. It is written all over your face every time you come home. You look at me and see disappointment. You listen to your mother tell you that you made a mistake in marrying me and you believe her." "Margaret, that is not fair," Thomas said, finally meeting her eyes. "I am trying to hold this family together." Do you know how hard it is for me, being caught between you and my mother? Do you know how hard it is for me? Margaret asked, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. To live in this house where I am told daily that I am worthless. To sleep beside a husband who no longer touches me with any real tenderness, who looks at me like I am a puzzle he cannot solve and is growing tired of trying. I have lost myself in this marriage, Thomas. I do not even recognize who I am anymore. The words hung in the air between them, too honest and too raw to be taken back. Thomas's face flushed red, and Margaret saw anger flash in his eyes, the same stubborn pride that was his mother's most defining characteristic. If you are so unhappy, perhaps you should think about what you want to do about it, Thomas said, his voice cold. Because I am tired too, Margaret. Tired of the fighting, tired of the disappointment every month, tired of feeling like I failed somehow. Then maybe we are both tired of the wrong things, Margaret said quietly. Maybe we should have been fighting for each other instead of fighting with each other. Thomas did not answer. He simply turned and walked back out of the room, leaving Margaret standing alone with the truth of their broken marriage settling around her like dust after a storm. She heard him speaking to his mother in the front room, heard Constance's voice rise in what sounded like triumph, and Margaret knew that whatever fragile thread had been holding her marriage together had finally snapped. She waited until the house had gone quiet, until she heard Thomas moving around in the spare room where he sometimes slept when the mine had been particularly brutal, and then Margaret began to pack. She did not have much that was truly hers, just the clothes she had brought to the marriage and a few small treasures that had belonged to her mother. Everything fit into a single carpet bag, which seemed like a sad accounting of 5 years of marriage. The small amount of money she had managed to save from the egg sales, and the mending she took in from other families was hidden in a sock at the bottom of her drawer. It was not much, maybe $30 total, but it would have to be enough. Margaret counted it out by the light of the oil lamp, her fingers moving automatically while her mind raced ahead to the practicalities of what she was about to do. She could not stay here any longer. That much was clear. But where could she go? The boarding house in town was too expensive for more than a few nights, and besides, everyone in Cherry Creek knew everyone else's business. By tomorrow morning, the whole town would know that Margaret Morrison Whitmore had left her husband, and the gossip would be vicious. Constance would make sure of that, painting Margaret as the villain who abandoned a good man just because she could not fulfill her wifely duties. The thought made Margaret's stomach turn, but she pushed past the fear. She had to believe that there was something better waiting for her somewhere, some life where she could be valued for more than her ability to bear children. She just had to be brave enough to go find it. Margaret waited until the house was fully dark and silent before she crept out of the bedroom, her carpet bag in one hand and her boots in the other. She moved through the shadowy hallway like a ghost, past the closed door of the room where Thomas slept, past Constance's room where she could hear the older woman's heavy breathing. The front door creaked slightly as she eased it open, and Margaret froze, her heart hammering, but no one stirred. The night air was cool after the stuffiness of the house, and Margaret stood on the front step for a long moment, breathing in the smell of sage and dust that was the perfume of Nevada. The stars overhead were so thick and bright, they looked like spilled salt across black velvet, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the moon. Margaret pulled on her boots and started walking, though she had no clear destination in mind. Her feet carried her toward the main street of Cherry Creek, past the darkened storefronts, and the saloon where yellow light still spilled from the windows, and the tinny sound of a piano played. A few rough-looking men sat on the porch, and Margaret kept her head down and her pace quick, not wanting to attract attention. At the far end of town, near the livery stable, there was a small office with a sign that read Western Express Company. Margaret had seen it dozens of times, had watched the stage coaches come and go, carrying people to places like Carson City and Virginia City, and even San Francisco. She had never imagined she might be one of those travelers, but now she stood in front of the office and considered her options. The stage ran twice a week, and according to the schedule posted in the window, the next one would leave at dawn, just a few hours from now. The fare to Carson City was $8. Margaret had enough money, but just barely, and she would arrive in a strange city with no prospects and no one to turn to for help. But staying in Cherry Creek was not an option. Not anymore. Margaret settled herself on the bench outside the stage office, arranging her skirts around her and clutching her carpetbag close. The hours until dawn stretched out long and uncomfortable, and she dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound. When the first gray light began to creep across the eastern horizon, she heard the sound of horses and the rattle of wheels, and the stagecoach pulled up in front of the office. The driver was a weathered man with a thick mustache and kind eyes, and he tipped his hat to Margaret as he climbed down from his seat. "Morning, miss. You looking to travel today?" "To Carson City," Margaret said, her voice sounding strange and hoarse to her own ears. "How much is the fare?" $8, the driver confirmed. "We will be stopping in Silver Springs for a meal and fresh horses, then pushing on to Carson City. Should arrive by late afternoon if the weather holds and we do not have any trouble." Margaret counted out the money from her small purse, her hands shaking slightly. This was real now. She was actually leaving. The driver took her payment and helped her into the coach, stowing her carpetbag on the roof with the other luggage. Margaret settled into a corner seat and stared out the window at Cherry Creek as the sky slowly lightened. She half expected to see Thomas come running down the street, having discovered her gone, but the town remained quiet and still. Either he had not yet woken, or he had discovered her absence and chosen not to pursue her. Margaret was not sure which possibility hurt more. The stagecoach lurched into motion just as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of rose and gold. Margaret watched Cherry Creek disappear behind them, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a smudge on the horizon, and then nothing at all. She had never been further than 10 miles from the town where she was born, and now she was heading into complete uncertainty. The only other passengers in the coach were an elderly couple who introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, heading to Carson City to visit their daughter, and a young man in a suit who looked like a salesman of some kind. They made polite conversation for the first hour, asking Margaret about her plans, and she gave vague answers about visiting family, hating the lies but knowing the truth was too complicated and shameful to share with strangers. The landscape rolled past outside the window, vast and empty and beautiful in its own harsh way. Sagebrush and scrub dotted the sandy earth, and in the distance, mountains rose up like the spine of some great sleeping beast. Margaret had always found the desert beautiful, even in its austerity, and she pressed her forehead against the glass and watched the world pass by. They stopped in Silver Springs around midday, and Margaret climbed down from the coach on stiff legs, grateful for the chance to stretch and use the facilities. The meal stop was at a rough wooden building that served as both a stage station and a small restaurant, and Margaret forced herself to eat some of the stew and bread that was offered, knowing she needed to keep her strength up even though her stomach was in knots. She was standing outside in the shade of the building's overhang, trying to work up the courage to climb back into the coach and continue this journey into the unknown, when she heard a man's voice from around the corner. No, I told you. I need a horse that can handle rough terrain. I am heading up into the mountains, not taking a Sunday ride through town. The voice was deep and carried the slight drawl of someone who had been born out west, and there was something in the tone that made Margaret curious. She stepped around the corner and saw a tall man in conversation with what appeared to be the station master. The man wore dusty trail clothes, a leather vest over a dark shirt, and a hat that had clearly seen many miles. He stood with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, one hand resting on the gun belt at his hip. "The roan is your best bet then," the station master was saying, "but he will cost you $30. "That is robbery," the man said, but there was no real heat in his voice. "But I do not have much choice, do I? Fine. $30, but I want a saddle that is not held together with prayers and good intentions." The station master laughed and headed off toward the stables, leaving the tall man standing alone. He turned, and his eyes met Margaret's across the dusty yard. They were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage after a rain, and his face was lean and tanned from long hours in the sun. He had a strong jaw covered with a few days' growth of beard, and his mouth quirked up in a slight smile when he saw her watching him. "Forgive me, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in polite greeting. "I did not mean to disturb you with my haggling." "You did not disturb me," Margaret said, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just waiting for the stage to be ready." "Heading to Carson City?" the man asked, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Yes," Margaret said. "And you mentioned the mountains." "Up into the high country," he confirmed. "I have a ranch up that way, small operation. Been down in the valley selling some horses and picking up supplies. Name is Lucas Sterling, by the way." "Margaret Morrison," Margaret said, using her maiden name without even thinking about it. She was not ready to claim the name Whitmore anymore. Not when leaving that identity behind was the whole point of this journey. Lucas Sterling studied her for a moment, and Margaret had the strange feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking in her worn dress and the weariness that must have been evident in her face. But when he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "First time traveling alone?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, first time traveling much of anywhere, really." "It can be daunting," Lucas said. "The world is a big place when you step outside of familiar territory, but it can also be full of possibilities." He paused, then added, "You look like someone who is running from something, if you do not mind me saying so, or maybe running toward something. Either way, I hope you find what you are looking for in Carson City." "Thank you," Margaret said softly, surprised by the kindness in his words. "I hope so too, though truthfully I am not entirely sure what I am looking for." "Sometimes that is the best way to start," Lucas said. "With an open mind and no expectations. The world has a way of surprising us when we let it." The station master returned with a saddled horse, a beautiful roan with intelligent eyes, and Lucas excused himself to complete his business. Margaret watched him check the saddle and cinches with practiced efficiency, moving around the horse with the easy grace of someone who had been working with animals his entire life. He mounted up in one smooth motion and gathered the reins, then looked over at Margaret one more time. "Safe travels, Margaret Morrison," he said. "Maybe our paths will cross again someday." "Maybe," Margaret said, though she could not imagine how that would be possible. He was heading into the mountains and she was going to Carson City. Their worlds had intersected for just a brief moment, and now they would spin off in different directions. Lucas Sterling tipped his hat one more time and turned his horse toward the north, and Margaret watched him ride away until he was just a distant figure against the vast landscape. Something about the encounter had left her feeling unsettled, though she could not quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was simply the kindness he had shown, a reminder that not everyone in the world viewed her as a disappointment. The stage driver called for the passengers to board, and Margaret climbed back into the coach, settling into her corner seat for the remainder of the journey. The elderly couple had dozed off, leaning against each other in a way that spoke of many years and comfortable familiarity, and Margaret felt a pang of longing for what she had thought she would have with Thomas, but never quite achieved. The afternoon wore on, hot and dusty, and Margaret's thoughts churned as relentlessly as the wheels of the coach. What would she do when she reached Carson City? She had no skills beyond housework and mending, nothing that would set her apart from any other woman looking for employment. She supposed she could try to find work as a housekeeper or maybe in a restaurant, but even those positions would be difficult to secure without references. And what would happen when Thomas realized she was truly gone? Would he come looking for her? Or would he simply accept the end of their marriage with the same resignation he had shown toward everything else in their relationship? Would Constance celebrate Margaret's departure, glad to be rid of the useless daughter-in-law, or would she use it as further evidence of Margaret's failings? The questions had no answers, at least not yet, and Margaret forced herself to stop spinning through the what-ifs and focus on the immediate future. One step at a time. That was all she could manage right now. They arrived in Carson City, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town was considerably larger than Cherry Creek, with real streets and proper buildings, and the stage pulled up in front of a hotel that looked far too expensive for Margaret's limited budget. She climbed down from the coach with the other passengers, collecting her carpet bag from the driver with a murmured thanks. The elderly couple hurried off, apparently expected by their daughter, and the salesman disappeared into the hotel without a backward glance. Margaret stood on the boardwalk and looked around, trying to get her bearings. "You need help finding somewhere to stay, miss?" the stage driver asked, apparently noticing her uncertainty. "Something inexpensive," Margaret admitted. "I do not have much money." The driver nodded sympathetically. "Try Mrs. Chen's boarding house, 3 blocks that way," he pointed down the main street. "She is fair with her prices and runs a respectable establishment. Tell her Bill from the stage line sent you." "Thank you," Margaret said gratefully, and set off in the direction he had indicated. Mrs. Chen's boarding house turned out to be a tidy 2-story building painted white with green shutters, and the woman who answered Margaret's knock was small and brisk, with dark hair streaked with gray and sharp eyes that assessed Margaret in a single glance. "Yes," she said, not unkindly but with the efficient tone of someone who had no time to waste. "Bill from the stage line said you might have a room available," Margaret said. "Something inexpensive. I am new to town and looking for work." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. Come in, come in. I have a small room on the 2nd floor, share a washroom with 2 other ladies. $3 a week, includes breakfast and dinner. You keep your room clean and follow my rules, we will get along fine." $3 a week would eat through Margaret's savings quickly, but she nodded. "I will take it, thank you. And if you know of anyone who might be hiring, I would appreciate any information." "What kind of work are you looking for?" Mrs. Chen asked, leading Margaret up a narrow staircase. "Anything respectable," Margaret said. "I can cook clean, so I managed a household." Mrs. Chen opened a door at the end of the hallway, revealing a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out over the street. "I will ask around," she said. "Carson City is growing, always people needing help. But I will be honest with you, most positions want references." "You have references," Margaret's heart sank. No, my situation is complicated. Husband, Mrs. Chen asked bluntly. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. I see, Mrs. Chen said, and her expression was more understanding than judgmental. Well, we will figure something out. I have been in this business long enough to know that women sometimes need to start fresh. First week's rent in advance, and then we will see about finding you some work. Margaret paid the $3, watching her savings dwindle, and Mrs. Chen left her alone to settle in. The room was small but felt luxurious compared to the cramped quarters she had shared with Thomas in his mother's house, if only because it was hers alone. Margaret set her carpetbag on the bed and sank down beside it, suddenly overwhelmed with exhaustion. She had done it. She had left Cherry Creek, left her marriage, stepped out into the unknown. The reality of it hit her all at once, and Margaret pressed her hands to her face and let herself cry for the first time since walking out of Constance Whitmore's house. She cried for the years she had wasted trying to be enough for people who would never be satisfied, for the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of expectations, for the parents who had loved her unconditionally but were no longer there to guide her. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret felt hollowed out but somehow cleaner, as if the crying had washed away some of the accumulated pain. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her mother's things on top of the dresser. The room began to feel a bit more like her own, a space she could breathe in. Dinner was served in a communal dining room on the first floor, and Margaret joined the other boarders around a large table. Mrs. Chen introduced her to the other residents, a mix of single working women, an elderly man who seemed to be a permanent fixture, and a young couple who were saving money for a house of their own. The food was simple but good, and the conversation was pleasant, no one prying too deeply into Margaret's background. After dinner, Margaret retreated to her room and stood at the window, looking out at the unfamiliar streets of Carson City. Somewhere out there was her future, whatever shape it might take. She just had to be brave enough to reach for it. The next morning, Margaret set out to look for work. She walked up and down the main streets, stopping at every shop, restaurant, and business that looked like it might need help. At each stop, the response was the same. They were not hiring, or they needed references, or they had already filled their positions. By midday, Margaret's feet ached and her spirits were flagging. She was walking past the general store, trying to decide whether to go in and ask yet again, when she heard a familiar voice call her name. Margaret turned in surprise to see Lucas Sterling riding down the street, leading a string of 3 horses behind his roan. He reined in when he reached her, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "Margaret Morrison," he said, "I did not expect to see you again so soon. I thought you were heading to Carson City to visit family." Margaret felt her face flush with the memory of that small lie. "Plans changed," she said, not wanting to elaborate. Lucas studied her for a moment, then dismounted, looping his reins over a hitching post. "You look like someone who is having a rough day," he observed, "and I am guessing the family visit was not quite the truth." Margaret wanted to be offended by his directness, but she was too tired to maintain pretenses. "No," she admitted, "it was not. I came here looking for work, but it seems Carson City has no need for someone without references or particular skills." Lucas was quiet for a moment, and Margaret expected him to make his excuses and move on. Instead, he said, "Well, that seems like a waste. Anyone who is willing to pack up and start over in a strange town clearly has courage and determination, and those count for more than references in my book. Unfortunately, most employers do not share your perspective," Margaret said with more bitterness than she intended. "Most employers are fools," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "Look, I do not mean to pry into your business, but you helped pass a pleasant few minutes back at the stage stop, so let me return the favor. What kind of work are you looking for? Anything respectable, Margaret said, the same answer she had given Mrs. Chen. I can cook, clean, so manage accounts. I helped run my parents' ranch before they died, so I know how to work hard and handle responsibility. Lucas nodded slowly, and Margaret could see him thinking something through. Finally, he said, I have a proposition for you if you are willing to hear it. My ranch is up in the mountains about 20 miles northeast of here. It is not much, just me and my foreman, and we are barely scraping by trying to build up the horse stock. The house is falling apart because neither of us has the time or inclination to deal with cooking and cleaning and mending. We have been living like animals, basically, eating beans out of cans and wearing clothes with more holes than fabric. He paused, then continued, What I am saying is, I could use a housekeeper. Someone to cook decent meals, keep the place from collapsing into total chaos, maybe help with the books since I am terrible at record keeping. It would not be fancy work, and the pay would not be much to start, maybe $15 a month plus room and board. But it would be honest work and a roof over your head, and I promise you would be treated with respect. Margaret stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. You are offering me a job, but you barely know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook or a thief or any number of things. Could be, Lucas agreed. But I have learned to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts say you are someone who has been dealt a rough hand but is trying to play it with dignity. That is worth something in my book. Besides, I am desperate enough that even a mediocre cook would be an improvement over what we have been surviving on. Why do you live all the way up in the mountains? Margaret asked, still trying to process this unexpected offer. Would it not be easier to have a ranch down in the valley? Easier, yes, Lucas said. But I prefer the solitude, and the high country is good for horses, builds their endurance, keeps them healthy. And I like being able to look around and see nothing but wilderness in every direction. Makes me feel like there is still some freedom left in this world. Margaret understood that sentiment more than she would have a week ago. She looked at Lucas Sterling, this near stranger who was offering her an escape from her increasingly desperate situation, and tried to weigh the risks. Going to live on an isolated ranch with two men she did not know could be dangerous, or at the very least improper. But staying in Carson City with her savings running out and no prospects was not much better. And something about Lucas's straightforward manner and the kindness in his eyes made her want to trust him. Would there be anyone else at the ranch? She asked. Another woman, perhaps? No, Lucas admitted. Just me and my foreman, Jake. I will not lie to you and say it would not be unconventional for you to be the only woman on the property. But I give you my word that you would be treated with complete respect, and you would have your own quarters with a door that locks. If at any point you felt unsafe or uncomfortable, I would personally escort you back to Carson City, no questions asked. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at a crossroads. She could play it safe, stay in Carson City and hope something turned up, slowly watching her money disappear until she had nothing left. Or she could take a chance on this unexpected opportunity, trust that sometimes the universe sent help in unexpected packages. I would want to be clear about the expectations, Margaret said slowly. I would be there as a housekeeper, nothing more. I need you to understand that. Absolutely, Lucas said without hesitation. I am looking for someone to help run the household, not anything else. I have no ulterior motives, Margaret, I promise you that. Then I accept, Margaret said, the words coming out before she could second-guess herself. When would you want me to start? I need to finish my business in town, sell these horses and pick up supplies, Lucas said, looking pleased. That will take me a day or two. How about I come by wherever you are staying in 2 days, first thing in the morning, and we head up to the ranch? That gives you time to make sure this is what you want and to get your affairs in order. Margaret gave him the address of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, and they shook hands on the agreement. Lucas's grip was firm and warm, and Margaret felt a little flutter in her stomach that she firmly told herself was just nerves about the new situation. "Thank you," she said softly. "You cannot know how much this means to me." "I think I have some idea," Lucas said gently. "We all need a fresh start sometimes, Margaret. I am glad I can help provide you with one." He swung back into his saddle, tipped his hat to her once more, and continued down the street with his string of horses. Margaret stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. 2 days ago, she had been trapped in a miserable marriage in Cherry Creek. Now she was in Carson City, about to embark on a new life as a housekeeper on a mountain ranch for a man who had shown her more genuine kindness in 2 brief conversations than her husband had managed in months. The world truly did work in mysterious ways. Margaret returned to the boarding house and told Mrs. Chen about the job offer. The older woman listened carefully, her expression thoughtful, then said, "Sterling. I know that name. Family used to have a big ranch up north, very successful until the father gambled most of it away. The son, Lucas, left years ago and started over on his own. People say he is honest and hardworking, so if that is the same man, you could do worse. But you be careful, young lady. A woman alone with men, even good men, can find herself in a difficult position." "He promised me my own quarters and complete respect," Margaret said. "Promises are easy to make," Mrs. Chen said pragmatically. "But I will say this. If you stay here in Carson City with no money and no prospects, your options will get worse, not better. Sometimes you have to take a calculated risk. Just keep your wits about you and trust your instincts." Margaret spent the next 2 days preparing for the move, which consisted mostly of mending her clothes and trying not to second-guess her decision. She walked around Carson City, learning the layout of the town in case she needed to find her way back quickly. She watched people going about their lives, and she wondered what her life would look like in a month or 6 months or a year. On the appointed morning, Margaret was up before dawn, her carpetbag packed and ready. She waited on the front porch of the boarding house, watching the sun slowly paint the eastern sky with color. Lucas Sterling arrived right as the first rays of sunlight hit the street, driving a sturdy-looking wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. He climbed down and greeted Margaret with a warm smile. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked. "Ready as I will ever be," Margaret replied, and let him help her up onto the wagon seat. They headed out of Carson City as the town was just beginning to wake up, and soon the buildings gave way to open country. The road climbed steadily as they moved northeast, the valley falling away behind them. Lucas kept up a running commentary as they traveled, pointing out landmarks and telling Margaret about the land they were passing through. "That peak there, the one that looks like a broken tooth, we call that Widow's Point," he said. "Story goes that a woman waited there every day for her husband to return from the gold fields, and when she finally accepted he was never coming back, she threw herself off the edge." "Probably not true, but it makes for a good story." "That is a terrible story," Margaret said, though she was smiling despite herself. "Most of the old stories out here are terrible," Lucas said cheerfully. "Death and heartbreak and bad decisions. That is basically the whole history of the West in a nutshell. But we keep on going anyway, keep on hoping the next chapter will be better than the last." They stopped around midday to rest the horses and eat the lunch Lucas had packed. Simple sandwiches and apples, but welcome after the long morning of travel. Margaret sat on a fallen log and looked around at the landscape, which had become increasingly wild and beautiful the higher they climbed. Pine trees were starting to appear among the sage, and the air smelled crisp and clean. "It is beautiful up here," she said. "I can see why you chose this place." "Wait until you see the ranch," Lucas said. "It is not much to look at right now, but the location cannot be beat. There is a creek that runs right through the property, never goes dry even in the worst summers, and meadows where the grass grows thick for the horses. On a clear day, you can see 50 miles in every direction. Makes you feel small in the best possible way, if that makes sense." "It does," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. She had spent so long feeling small in the worst possible way, crushed under the weight of other people's expectations and disappointments. The idea of feeling small because the world was vast and beautiful, rather than because she was inadequate, held a certain appeal. They reached the ranch in late afternoon, and Margaret's first glimpse was of a small log house nestled in a wide valley, with mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. A creek sparkled in the sunlight, and horses grazed in a fenced meadow. The house was rough but solid, with a stone chimney and a covered porch, and there were several outbuildings that looked like they served as barn, stable, and storage. Lucas pulled the wagon up in front of the house, and a man emerged from the barn. He was older than Lucas, probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of many years working outdoors. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "Jake," Lucas called out, "come meet our new housekeeper." "Margaret Morrison, this is Jake Patterson, my foreman and the best horseman you will ever meet." Jake approached and touched his hat politely, his eyes curious but not unfriendly. "Madam," he said, "welcome to the Sterling Ranch. I hope you know what you are getting yourself into, because this place is more chaos than civilization most days." "I think I can handle chaos," Margaret said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "I have had plenty of practice." Jake grinned at that. "I like her already, boss. She has a sense of humor. That will come in handy around here." Lucas showed Margaret around the property, and she could see immediately what he had meant about the place falling into disrepair from lack of attention to domestic matters. The house was dusty and cluttered, with dishes stacked in the kitchen and clothes draped over every surface. But the bones of it were good, and Margaret could envision how it might look with some care and attention. Her quarters were in a small room off the back of the house, clearly added at some point after the main structure was built. It had a narrow bed, a dresser, a chair, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Most importantly, it had a door with a sturdy lock, just as Lucas had promised. "I know it is not much," Lucas said, looking almost apologetic, "but it is private and you can make it your own however you like." "It is perfect," Margaret said honestly. After sharing cramped quarters with Thomas in his mother's house, this little room felt like a palace. They agreed on the specifics of her employment over dinner that evening, which Margaret cooked from the supplies in the kitchen. She made a simple stew and biscuits, nothing fancy, but both Lucas and Jake ate like starving men and complimented her cooking so enthusiastically that Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction. "Your duties will be cooking 3 meals a day, keeping the house clean and in good repair, and helping me with the record keeping and accounts," Lucas explained. "Jake and I will handle all the ranch work, the horses and cattle and repairs to the outbuildings. You are welcome to explore the property and learn about the operation if you are interested, but that is not required. Your day off will be Sunday, when you are free to do whatever you like, and I will make sure to get you into Carson City once a month if you need to purchase personal items or want to attend church or anything like that." "That sounds more than fair," Margaret said. "When would you like me to start?" "How about tomorrow morning?" Lucas suggested with a grin. "Because as you can see, this place desperately needs some attention." Margaret laughed, and it felt good to laugh, light and genuine in a way she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. "Tomorrow morning it is." She fell asleep that night in her little room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl, and felt more at peace than she had in years. This was a new beginning, a chance to prove that she was more than the sum of Constance Whitmore's judgments. The next morning, Margaret rose with the sun and set about transforming the Sterling ranch house. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, organizing the supplies and making a list of things they were running low on. Then she moved through the main room, collecting all the scattered clothes and dishes, opening windows to let fresh air chase out the stale smell of too many months of bachelor living. Lucas and Jake had both headed out early to work with the horses, so Margaret had the house to herself. She found a surprising satisfaction in the work, in seeing the immediate results of her efforts. By midday, the main room looked completely different, clean and organized and welcoming. She prepared a hearty lunch and rang the bell that hung on the porch to call the men in. They appeared from the direction of the meadows, both dusty and tired, and stopped short when they entered the house. Lucas looked around with something like wonder on his face. "Margaret, this is incredible," he said. "I had forgotten the house could look like this." "You have accomplished more in one morning than Jake and I have managed in 6 months." "That is a low bar, boss," Jake said dryly. "We were living like animals. But yes, Miss Morrison, this is mighty impressive, and whatever that is cooking smells like heaven." "Just stew and cornbread," Margaret said, pleased by their reactions. "Nothing fancy, but I promise you will not be eating beans from a can anymore." Over the following weeks, Margaret settled into a rhythm at the ranch. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and gradually brought order to the household. She took over the account books and found them in a state of near disaster, with entries missing or incorrectly recorded, and she spent hours sorting through the mess and creating a proper system. In her free time, she explored the property, walking along the creek and through the meadows, learning the names of the horses and watching Lucas and Jake work with them. Lucas was patient with the animals, gentle but firm, and Margaret could see why his horses were developing a reputation for quality. He had a gift for understanding them, for knowing what they needed before they knew it themselves. She found herself looking forward to the evenings when the work was done, and the three of them would sit on the porch and talk. Lucas told stories about growing up on his family's ranch, about the mistakes his father had made and the lessons Lucas had learned from them. Jake shared his own history, about being a cavalry scout in his younger days before an injury in an Apache raid had left him with his limp, and a desire for a quieter life. Margaret was more cautious about sharing her own story, but gradually, in pieces, it emerged. She told them about her parents and the ranch she had grown up on, about meeting Thomas and thinking she had found love. She told them about Constance Whitmore and the years of being told she was worthless, though she found herself growing angry rather than sad when she spoke about it now. "That woman sounds like a nightmare," Jake said bluntly one evening, "and your husband sounds like a coward for not standing up for you." "Jake," Lucas said warningly, but Margaret shook her head. "No, he is right," she said. "Thomas was never cruel to me directly, but he was weak. He let his mother poison our marriage rather than choose to protect what we had built together. That is its own kind of cruelty." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I think it takes more courage to leave a bad situation than it does to endure it. A lot of people would have stayed, would have kept trying to make themselves smaller and smaller to fit into a space that was never meant for them. You chose to believe you deserved better, and that is something to be proud of." Margaret looked at him in surprise, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I needed to hear that." As the autumn deepened and the aspens on the mountainsides turned brilliant gold, Margaret realized she was happy. It was a strange feeling, one she had almost forgotten, but there was no other word for the contentment that filled her days. She loved the rhythm of ranch life, the honest work and the beautiful surroundings. She loved the easy companionship she had found with Lucas and Jake, the way they treated her as an equal partner in the operation rather than as a servant. And she was developing deeper feelings for Lucas specifically, though she tried to keep them carefully hidden. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the strength in his hands when he worked with the horses, the thoughtful way he approached every problem. She noticed how he always made sure she had the best portion of meat at dinner, how he fixed the loose step on the porch without being asked, because he knew it worried her, how he listened when she talked as if every word she said mattered. Margaret told herself it was foolish to develop feelings for her employer, especially when she was still technically a married woman, even if that marriage was dead in every way that mattered. But the heart did not always listen to logic, and she found herself daydreaming about Lucas more than was wise. The first snow came in early November, dusting the high peaks with white and signaling the approaching winter. Lucas and Jake worked longer hours preparing for the harsh months ahead, bringing in extra feed for the horses, checking and repairing fences, making sure all the outbuildings were secure. Margaret preserved and canned everything she could from the small garden she had discovered and revived behind the house, and she made sure the woodpile was well stocked. One evening, about 3 months after Margaret had arrived at the ranch, Lucas asked her to walk with him down to the creek after supper. It was an unusual request, as their pattern had been to relax on the porch together, and Margaret felt a flutter of nerves as she accompanied him away from the house. The creek was running high from recent rains in the mountains, and the sound of the water was soothing in the gathering darkness. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts, and Margaret waited patiently. Finally, he said, "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something, and I hope you will forgive me if I am overstepping." "What is it?" Margaret asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Jake mentioned to me that you received a letter today," Lucas said. "From your husband. I do not want to pry, but I could see it upset you, and I want you to know that if you need to talk about it, I am here to listen." Margaret had indeed received a letter that afternoon, forwarded from Mrs. Chen's boarding house in Carson City. She had recognized Thomas's handwriting on the envelope and had felt her stomach drop. She had not opened it yet, had not been able to bring herself to face whatever he had written. "I have not read it," she admitted. "I am afraid of what it might say." "Do you want me to read it first?" Lucas offered. "I could tell you if it is something you need to hear or if it is just more of the same poison you left behind." Margaret considered this, then shook her head. "No, I need to face it myself, but would you stay with me while I read it?" "I do not want to be alone." "Of course," Lucas said immediately. They walked back to the house, and Margaret retrieved the letter from her room. Lucas suggested they sit in the main room, and he stoked the fire while Margaret broke the seal on the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was short, written in Thomas's careful script. "Margaret," it began, "Mother has insisted I write to you to inform you that I have begun proceedings to end our marriage on the grounds of desertion. She believes this is the best course of action and will allow me to move forward with my life. I do not know where you have gone or what you are doing, but I hope you have found whatever it